I'm Tamara Cherry, author of The Trauma Beat and host of The Trauma Beat. I talk a lot about the impact of the media on trauma survivors, but for this week's episode, what about the impact of trauma on members of the media? Here we go. Okay. Dave, why don't you just start out by introducing yourself?
Hi there, I'm Dave Seglins. I am a veteran journalist based in Toronto. I worked for CBC for many years as an investigative journalist. And in the last 2 years, I've taken on an added job title. I call it the well-being champion. And that is working as an educator and an advocate, both within my own workplace, but also across the news media for enhanced understanding of mental health, trauma, and well-being.
Okay, so Dave, I'll point out that you and I both worked in Toronto at the same time for many years, though we must have worked in the field together for some stories, but the first time we really met was after I had left journalism. I'm going back like 2 years or so. I was in Toronto for something, and I don't even remember if I reached out to you or you reached out to me, but we were both sort of in the trauma space, and you were like very sort of new into this work and really passionate about getting it going. So how about you just start out by telling us a little bit about your journey to well-being champion?
Wow. Okay. So that's a lifetime of being human and experiencing all sorts of things in my own personal life. Life challenges, life traumas, grief, loss. So I'm a human, but then within the course of journalism over 25 years, I covered a lot of stuff like many of us do. And it was everything from tawdry kind of murders to traffic accidents to sexual abuse cases and trials. And so we interact as journalists with so much trauma, generally other people's trauma, but we're witnessing it. And that's, understood as being vicarious trauma. And so journalists get affected similar to how police officers, paramedics, firefighters, 911, call dispatchers, jurors, judges. I mean, the list goes on, translators, all sorts of jobs that traditionally we've thought of as being, just simply witnesses to other people's terrible stories. But what we've learned over the last decade is that these professions that consistently deal with the aversive details, the graphic images, and the emotional weight of other people's experiences are really at risk of carrying some of that and even being injured by some of it. So my journey, in the course of covering a really difficult trial, it was the case of Colonel Russell Williams, a military commander, for those who don't know the story, who evolved into a sadomasochistic serial killer. Good times. And sitting through the court coverage and the sentencing hearing, it was 4 days of just graphic, off the charts kind of stuff. And everybody in that courtroom, and that includes the victims and the families who suffered because of the consequences, but the court workers and the police officers and the guards and the journalists and all of those people will never forget that stuff. Anyway, I emerged from it with PTSD, and I didn't understand it at the time. And I didn't get particularly great help from my employer, but I went to a trauma specialist and explained what I'd covered and explained that I'm having these feelings of dread. I can't get out of bed. I feel like I'm dying. I'm in a state of panic all the time. And they said something really interesting to me. They said, well, that sounds pretty normal. And I said, what do you mean it's normal? And that began my journey to understanding that even vicarious trauma has this impact on our psyches and our bodies that can leave lasting scars. And so I was diagnosed with PTSD. That was more than a decade ago. Fast forward to the pandemic, working under lots of stress, with a team of investigative folks. We were looking at all the angles of workplaces that weren't protecting their employees from the as yet unknown virus, or the virus that we didn't have a vaccine against. And it was a really stressful time. And I was assigned to a breaking news story involving a historical child sex murder case. And I was like, I hit a wall. I said, I can't do this. And when I said that to my bosses, the answer was, well, you can't refuse an assignment. And I said, well, I'm not trying to refuse an assignment exactly. I'm trying to protect my mental health here. I know what it is to be through the ringer. And they said, well, maybe it's time you found something else to do. And it was that moment, it was at that moment I said to myself, you know what? The words were, this is not the way it's supposed to work. And I reflected on that. I said, you know what? This is exactly how it's supposed to work. I'm a 25-year veteran who's been through the rigor. I know what PTSD is. If I'm in the height of stress and I can't put up my hand, as a senior white guy in the newsroom with a secure union protected job, who can? And so that was really an inspiration for me to say, we've got to get better at this. And instead of being angry and frustrated and bitter, I said to my bosses, let's work on this, because this is not sustainable. And I know that, that's my story, but I know that that's a story that lots of journalists encounter when they are given assignments that don't sit right with them. What are their options? And for so long in our industry, it's been suck it up, you just do it, and to not cover these stories and not just go out there and just pretend like you're not human. Anyway, it hasn't been an option. It has been part of the discussion. I'm happy to say I think things are starting to change.
Yeah, and big thanks to you, Dave. I personally, having been a journalist in Toronto for many years, I relate to so much of what you just said there. First of all, journalism is so competitive, but we often think about the competition between different newsrooms, but there's also competition within newsrooms. So I think there's also this, well, if you don't do the story, then this new young star reporter who we're eyeing for this anchor position of this, then she'll be happy to do it, or he'll be happy to do it. So I feel like there's also that sort of at play. But there's a few things I want to unpack from what you just said, because they're very significant. So number one, you said, when I asked you, about your journey, it goes back forever because you're a human. And so that's something that we don't often talk about in trauma, because it's like, okay, what was the event that did you in? What was it? And I get asked that a lot when I talk about my own trauma from the job. Like, young journalism students will just ask me, like, so what was it that happened that made you? And I'm like, where do I start? But we also
everybody wants our
own. Yeah, go ahead.
Everybody wants it to be a single thing.
Yes.
Right? And we say, oh, it's a single story. Well, we know that trauma doesn't work that way. Yeah. I mean, there can be a really significant event in somebody's life, or a significant event in a journalist's career that is ever changing. And that's acute trauma. But the reality is, we are humans, and over time we experience all sorts of things. And, you talk to the experts, the clinicians, things that happen in your childhood can, that may have scarred you then, may come back to haunt you later in life. So we are complex psychological beings, even as journalists. Imagine.
We're not robots. We're not just objective flies on the wall, right? We can't be, because we are human. What you're saying reminds me of the words shared with me by a good friend of mine who's a camera guy and suffered from PTSD. And his therapist told him, you can only park those traumatic memories. Like, your brain is a parking lot. You can only park those traumatic memories back in the boonies for so long before they all sort of start tumbling out and everything comes crashing down. And again, that's something I could really relate to myself. But when I think about you, and you talked about the Russell Williams trial, it's like that was like the perfect situation for everything to come tumbling out. You were isolated, there were a lot of other journalists there, but that's not a trial that happened in Toronto, in your hometown. It was a couple hours away, if I remember correctly, right? Where did they have that? London or?
Yeah, Belleville.
Belleville, right.
It was Eastern Ontario.
Right. And then you said that there were, just a few days of packed with trauma. So what people who aren't familiar with this case might not understand is that this was a guilty plea. And if it wasn't a guilty plea, it probably would have been like an 8-week or more trial. There was so much evidence. But what was rare was, because of the egregiousness of these crimes and the volume of these crimes, they really wanted to pack everything into those days. And things that would have otherwise just made it into an agreed statement of fact were actually played in court. So you witnessed so much trauma in such a short period of time. And then the other thing, and I don't know if you remember this, Dave, but I remember because I wasn't covering that trial, but I was working at the Toronto Sun at the time and watching the Twitter feeds of reporters who were in that courtroom. That was, if I remember correctly, like the first court case where it was like on Twitter, you know, journalists had, right? So
it was early days, and
yeah.
that was part of my job.
Yes,
you know, not only was I doing radio hits and stepping out to do live TV hits here and there, but we were also trying, and we didn't understand Twitter fully, and so we were like every sort of little sentence, every little update, and so
yes.
we were working at a ridiculous pace. And you're quite right, because it was a sentencing hearing, it was condensed into 4 days, and it wasn't broken up by cross-examination and a pause for the next witness. It was just this 4 days of litany of facts and video and photos. That part was crazy. But also because it was in a small town, and yes, we were isolated. And for me personally, I had 2 young children, little babies. And so that would, I think, affected me in a weird way, but also because there were only so many seats in the courtroom.
I was just going to say
be there at 4:45 in the morning.
Yes, and so I remember Christy Blatchford talking about that.
Yeah, Blatch and I were at the front of the line because we weren't going to miss this, but it meant being there at 4:45 in the morning.
So you're not sleeping
and by the time we were not sleeping well, but even worse than that, because I was preparing and I was trying to get really good interviews each evening from the testimony, from the actual witnesses that we knew their story was coming up the next day. So I wouldn't finish my working day until 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. And then what did we do? We all went out to the bar, right?
That's what journalists do,
pints.
Or did for many years.
So you're quite right. It was a recipe for disaster, given the nature of the content, the lack of sleep, the work product that came out of us, be it on Twitter or just kind of around the clock. Yeah, it was really something. Anyway,
there was a study that I referred to in my book, and I don't want to misquote it now, but it was a study on vicarious trauma. And it essentially said that journalists are at a heightened risk of developing PTSD because they rarely have time between the traumatic event that they witness and the filing of their story to just sit and process what has happened. And so when you're talking about like this huge thing compacted into 4 days, but then also Twitter, like I remember thinking like, how many people are going to be traumatized just reading these tweets, because it was so new and everybody just wanted to get everything out there. Like, it's like you wouldn't have been processing anything during that time. And then you come home and the world comes crashing down, right?
Well, it was my world did, or what often happens in the news business is that we will spend, and it doesn't have to be as extreme as the Russell Williams case. We can cover really tough stuff for a day. Yep. We file late, we barely process, and we come in the next day and we start all over again. So there isn't time. And so I call this, and it's known as the trauma load in journalism. We routinely expect of journalists that you come in, you're tabula rasa, and you are ready to go, and you can cover the toughest story. And what's worse, if you do a good job, then they'll actually come back to you and say, oh, you're so good at this, why don't you cover the next crime? Why don't you cover the next murder? Why don't you, the next trial? And so there are all sorts of things within our business that I think need to change. And I'm really happy to be having this kind of conversation, because it's actually a measure of something. It's a measure of a growing trauma awareness. Like, everybody's talking about trauma these days, right?
I know, it's really become a buzzword, trauma-informed.
Yeah, it's wellness, a buzzword. And
self-care.
To the point that my 15-year-old daughter, or when she was 15, she's a little older now, but she accused me of traumatizing her by making her do her homework.
She's barking up the wrong tree.
She chose the wrong customer. The point of the matter is, we use trauma really loosely now, but what has evolved is that our understanding that really difficult stories, images, and of what are, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the Bible of all things of psychiatric disorders, It was only updated in 2013 to say, look, professions that are routinely covering and exposed to other people's trauma are at heightened risk of PTSD. And this is the vicarious trauma, the secondary trauma. So that's only 10 years
Isn't
old.
that interesting?
So,
Because police and military, paramedics, like those frontline first responders, although journalists are considered first responders as well, but those sets of first responders are like, they've been talking about that for some time. So that's actually shocking that it wouldn't get into the DSM until 2013.
I mean, that's its own thing, right? That's where the
Yes,
American Psychiatric Association puts its stamp on something to say, yes,
right.
this is true. There have been lots of studies that have dated back,
For
and
sure.
credit to the military and credit to other frontline responders that have actually not only said, let's describe the problem, but let's find the solutions. And this is where journalism can look for some solutions. And I mean, I'm a big proponent of peer support, and we've built at CBC a peer support network now, which has been unheard of in the Canadian context. But lo and behold, when I started my work, I learned that, oh, Reuters and NPR, National Public Radio in the US, and the BBC and ABC Australia, they're all experimenting with having peer support, which is colleagues helping colleagues, talking about mental health and stress in the workplace. Those are solutions the military and other frontline responders figured out years ago. Critical incident debriefing. You talk about, the not having time to process. Well, when journalists cover big, major stories, we should build into our protocols a time to talk and decompress and just check in and help in the process. Processing of that trauma has to be part of the job. If exposure to it is, if we're getting paid to run toward the danger, as it were, and report back, then allowing some time to recover has to be built into a safe, healthy, sustainable journalism.
We'll be right back. You just said something interesting. You said, like, if we're covering these big events, but as you said, like before the Russell Williams case, you were covering all sorts of other traumas, traffic fatalities, homicides, and that stuff accumulates, right? And you also bring your own human life history to it. So how do we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, because I want to look back on some other stuff, but how do we identify when somebody might need help if it's not one of those stories where the big bosses send out a mass email to everybody in the newsroom, including many people who had nothing to do with the story, reminding them that mental health supports were available?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and this goes to some fairly big ideas. I mean, like we said, everybody's looking for that one big story. Oh, the big story, that's going to be the thing. And that's what causes, well, you can't predict. Everybody's different. Everybody metabolizes stress and trauma differently. And for lots of people who worked as journalists and covered the Russell Williams case, it didn't wind them up with PTSD. I was in a particular state, right? And I had things going on. But nobody asked me beforehand, how are you? How do you feel about this? No one acknowledged necessarily, you're going to see some really difficult things. What is your plan for that so the things that we can do
wait, what would you have said if somebody had asked you, like, how are you? How do you feel about going to cover this? What do you think you would have said?
10 years ago, I would have said, ready, no problem. And I would have been fearful with reasonable grounds that if I said no, they would think less of me as a reporter. Today, I think the conversation has shifted. And so this goes to the bigger solution. I think the way we're going to get better at this is through education and what I reduce to the word literacy. We need to be teaching in our journalism schools, and we need to be reflecting and holding courses within our news organizations, teaching people about vicarious trauma, because it is injuring lots of people. I can name more than 10 people. Look, I've actually gone to workers' compensation bodies across Canada and asked them how many journalists and frontline media professionals have suffered something that you've recognized as being work-related, a psychological injury from the work. And there are more than 24 cases that have gone all the way to the point of them being officially recognized. If that's that number, just imagine how many people didn't bother to apply. So
many. That's got to be just the teensiest, tiniest tip of the iceberg. I
And this is
never
what,
would have even thought about that. The first time that that sort of thing entered my brain was after I had left journalism. It would have been a year or so. I'm trying to remember when all of my stuff came crashing down. After I left journalism, and I was seeing a therapist, and I think I went to like submit it through my husband's benefits. I said, was this a result of a workplace incident or something like this, or these benefits? And I was like, ding. But I never would have thought of it and all the, crazy, I hate using that word, but there, I just did it, things that I was experiencing as being a direct result of my work. It felt so much more personal than that. And for that reason, I want to ask you one other thing before we continue down that road, Dave, because you said something else that was really interesting a few minutes ago. You said, if you are good at it, if you're good at these traumatic stories, then they'll keep putting you on them. And I think, like, for me anyway, when I was a crime reporter in Toronto, people used to, praise my reporting all the time. You're so good at it. Like, you can just convey the feeling and everything. And as I've thought back on this, and I feel like you're probably the same, like, very empathetic people are probably better at it in that regard. If you have your empathy, but then you also have that tough shell that allows you to like go and cultivate sources and knock on the doors, even when you feel like you shouldn't in your gut be there. But so I actually think that many times the people who are quote unquote good at these stories are also maybe the people who are most at risk of suffering adverse effects or mental stress injuries on the job.
I think the volume and the repetition of covering trauma puts us at risk. And so just because you're good doesn't mean you don't need to take a break. And taking a break doesn't have to mean weakness. I mean, we as the racehorse reporters who say, yes, send me, and I'll do the best I can and all of that. Okay, but where's the responsibility of the news employer to say, okay, we now know, right? We can't deny any longer. We now know, based on the DSM and everything we know about the vicarious trauma injury rates, we now know that journalists can get hurt. So is it responsible for media organizations to keep sending people day after day after day covering the same kinds of stuff? Or do you have to shake it up a little bit? And I would have hated that as a reporter, being told, no, we want you to go off and do something slightly different for a week or two so that you can process and you can get away from the dark stuff. But I think that's what we have to do. I think that's the way we're going to build healthy and sustainable journalism, as opposed to what happens. We're racehorses until we're not, until we crash. And again, I can think of so many fellow journalists who were at the peak of their careers and then suddenly mysteriously one day kind of went off on a leave. And when you start following up and you have conversations, you realize how many of them really just hit a trauma wall.
Oh, totally.
And got hurt. Yeah.
That's interesting though, Dave, because, okay, so you work for this huge broadcasting corporation in Canada. Your broadcasting corporation has a lot more resources than, say, smaller newsrooms. Smaller newsrooms who don't have things like, investigative units or, things that they can go off and do something else for a couple of weeks. How do you spread that trauma out when you're a news organization? Every day you're drinking from the fire hose, and it's like, how are we going to tell today's stories, the news that's just in front of us, with this literal handful of people? I think I mentioned to you in our previous conversation, I remember days when I was working at the Toronto Sun where I'd come in and be like, hey, I've got this great scoop on this homicide or whatever. And they'd say, well, that's great, but you're one of 2 reporters working today, so we need you to write like half the paper, essentially. How do you do that in those? And those situations are becoming more and more frequent as the news industry suffers.
So I totally acknowledge my great privilege working for CBC, Canada's public broadcaster, and I must stress here that I don't speak for all of CBC.
Right,
I speak in my capacity as a journalist and a mental health advocate. I don't have great solutions that are going to be immediate and satisfying, but part of my job at CBC is, yes, we're going to help the people internally. So I'm delivering courses and trying to create that literacy internally. I'm building support. So it's the peer support network, but it's also finding better psychological clinicians, people who actually are trained or have some understanding of how it is that journalists work so that they can be better prepared to help treat journalists who get injured on the job or are experiencing burnout or stress or trauma overload. But the third part of my job, and this I'm getting around to how do we help smaller newsrooms, is I'm working on a number of initiatives that are intended to help float industry generally and to try to help support industry generally. So part of my public appearance, even kind of me speaking today, CBC is pleased to have me, speaking more publicly to try to raise awareness about all of this, because I actually think it's through education and awareness and saying, it's no longer okay just to send people out without checking in on them. If that becomes the industry standard, and that's what we're teaching in our journalism schools, this is how we're going to change the culture slowly over time. That's not going to be a terribly satisfying answer to somebody who's in one of those 1 or 2 person reporter shops today that are being told you got to go and cover the car accident. But the truth of the matter is, changing the industry is going to take considerable time, and it means getting smarter. It means having more open discussions and creating space where we can actually talk about and acknowledge the emotional impact of the work on our own people. One of the big catalysts, I think, that has driven a societal change in talk about mental health is the pandemic, right? People were in this state of terror about a virus that was killing people. And then we started to learn more about it, and that subsided a little bit. But then we suffered this prolonged period of social isolation. And we're still learning how to get along again. And it happens to correspond in this period of our history of technology where we're all into our social media silos and politics are getting, I'm going very far afield here. But what happened during the pandemic is that mental health became a really noticeable thing. We were all deeply affected. This had nothing to do with the job that we did or what have you, although for those, I think of the nurses and the doctors and the healthcare professionals and the people who had to do essential services. Journalists were classed as essential, but I'm talking about the people who were dealing with the people who were intubated and on ventilators and all that sort of stuff. Those are the heroes in my mind in that context. But the point of the matter is, everybody societally was talking about and reflecting on their own mental health because it was hard. And there's been such a hangover from that. And I still think we don't fully appreciate the scars that the pandemic has left on us societally. But what it's done is it's propelled the conversation forward by decades, in my estimation. It's gotten rid of stigma to a large degree. It's now far more likely that your news, or whether it's a newsroom or your employer generally, has programs about mental health and is openly talking about it. So things are slowly changing. To the extent that it's going to trickle down and change the way we do our jobs in journalism, I think over time we're going to figure out better practices and they become the norm. One of the projects that I'm working on is a whole education series and video series that will teach best practices from newsrooms and organizations around the world on newsrooms that have gone through a crisis. For instance, we talked to somebody, one of the editors at the Texas Tribune that covered the Uvalde school mass shooting. And they've come up with some really interesting ways of how they would do a deployment differently in the next major trauma story. And so we learn and we evolve and we amplify and we share and we talk about this stuff. And hopefully over time, the culture shifts and the jobs get a little more humane. Because I think, historically speaking, the way you and I grew up in the business, number one, we got hurt, but it was not healthy. It was so devoid of our human selves, that just wasn't a consideration. It was always all about the story, and it wasn't get the story, do great work, but make sure you do it in a healthy way.
Yeah. Well, because as journalists, you're not supposed to be a part of the equation at all. The story's not about you. And any perception that it is impacting you, like in my mind anyway, I think I would have thought that maybe people might see a bias there, or this, like if this impacts me if I cry or whatever. I mean, I got over a lot of that stuff by the end of my career, but um, you're not tough enough to do it. I wonder, Dave, like with the environment that the pandemic created in terms of conversations around mental health, did that influence the timing of your taking care survey? I know the pandemic was a big part of it, but is this something you had been thinking about for a long time, or did you find yourself in a situation where you're like looking around and like, I don't think people are okay. I want to find out for sure.
Well, it was a confluence of events. I told you that story about when I put my hand up and said, I can't do this. That was at the height of the pandemic. I had my kids in the house. They
Right.
were homeschooling. I was balancing a lot of other death stories and COVID
Mm-hmm.
fear stories. And so I had a lot on my plate, number one. Number two, when in lockdown, and when I was told, sorry, you've got no choice but to cover this story again, I I kind of, it was a moment of reckoning for me where I said, you know what? This is not okay. And so it was at that point that I sort of reached out to my bosses and said, let's revisit this. And they said, okay, so what do you want to do? And I said, well, we should we should develop some courses where we actually think about and talk about uh, mental health in journalism. And because they were dealing with so many staff who were calling in and saying, look, I can't handle it. Like, I wasn't the only person that was
Yeah.
struggling. We were all struggling. Um, so they were like, yes, we need this. And so
Yes.
the timing all sort of came together. And, I had harbored for almost a decade,
Hmm.
I would say even a little bit of resentment based on my Russell Williams PTSD experience, where I felt like my employer didn't understand what I'd been through. There was very little acknowledgement, like none. No one's ever asked me about it inside my workplace. Even though I have spoken publicly and written about it, everyone was afraid to talk about it. And I thought to myself, you know what? I've got some wisdom over the years. I can give back. So, sorry, when all to the taking care survey, where did that come from? So it was at that moment I said to my bosses, so if we're having such big problems, can I get some data from the CBC to say, um, how many people are off on leave? What do we know about the scale of this problem? Well, for reasons that I sort of understand, CBC wasn't totally keen to give me, the private or even aggregate data on the health situation of our own employees. And I thought, you know what? To combat this and to fill a void, we need data to understand the scale of the problem. And so that's where we hatched a plan. Matthew Pearson and I, Matthew's a professor, former journalist, Ottawa Citizen, CBC, other places. He's now an associate professor at Carleton. We decided, let's do a national study. So that's what we did. And we called it the Taking Care Survey. We surveyed online. We got 1,251 responses. And it was a 20-minute survey, and huge proportion of people completed the whole thing. And we asked about everything. We asked about how you're doing in COVID. We asked about trauma exposure in the work that you do, how much trauma you're exposed to. Guess what? Tons, often, frequently. Then we asked some questions, rates of anxiety and depression. And, lots of people said, oh, yes, I've got anxiety and depression. And then we asked, okay, so how many of you have you ever been formally diagnosed by a doctor? And what was stunning is that the answer to that, the rates, 3-4 times the average population. I found that
Really?
surprising.
Wow.
And then another question, which I think is telling, is and surprising to me, because I had felt so alone for so long, is we asked, have you ever sought medical advice on work-related stress or trauma? and slightly over 50% said yes, they
Really?
have. And
Wow.
I went, isn't that interesting? These are things that we didn't know about our industry. And
Mhm.
so this is why I'm so thrilled that we had the opportunity to do this independent research. It was outside of CBC. It wasn't
Mhm.
specific about a particular newsroom or anything like that. And we got a really good snapshot. And I think it has propelled the conversation much further. Instead of it just being anecdotes about, oh, I heard about that guy Seglins who got PTSD, or I heard
Mhm.
about Tamara Cherry, who didn't she burn out or something? What happened to
Mhm.
her? Like, it's not just anecdotes. We now have a data set that says, yeah, we are deeply affected. We
Mhm.
are struggling within our profession. So now let's turn to solutions. And we make all sorts of recommendations in that regard.
So take me back a little bit, Dave, because if I remember correctly, when you were in the beginning stages of this survey, after you'd created the survey, you were trying to spread the word about it. You had a number of people. I was one of them that put little videos on social media saying, take the taking care survey. We want to know how everyone's doing. But you also went to newsrooms and tried to get them on board to I guess distribute it to their staff. What was the reception that you got from newsrooms across the country about this survey?
Um, Lukewarm. Um, I think most news leaders totally understood that there's a need, but news leaders especially in larger organizations don't tend to be the ones that are in charge of HR
Mm.
or their disability management. That's all dealt with by other. So we had a real range where lots of newsroom leaders were like, yeah, for sure, we'll send it out, we'll share it with our staff, we're happy to. Then there were some other newsrooms, uh, and I'm thinking in particular, Bell Media, that has the big Let's Talk campaign. CTV owned by Bell. I spoke to some leaders there. They were very supportive of the idea, but they did not feel that they could share this with their employees
Mm.
to get participation in a national study of mental health of media workers. And
Why? Was there a
that's,
why that was answered?
yeah, I think that I had some candid conversations, and without divulging who, there were great concerns about liabilities, and there were labor relations problems within some of the newsrooms, and they
Mm.
didn't want to stir things up. And so I found that sort of frustrating, let's say, because on the one hand, Bell needs to be credited for coining this phrase, let's talk, and promoting this idea of talk, because I actually believe that talking and creating space and literacy is really the key to improving how we approach mental health, not just in journalism, everywhere.
Mhm.
But when it came to their own newsrooms, they were not feeling that they could talk.
Mhm. That's really upsetting for me, obviously, on a personal level, because I worked for Bell, like CTV is owned by Bell Media. I feel upset right now and protective of the people who I know who not just at Bell, but who have suffered from this job. And you'll find people everywhere who have suffered from this job. Like yourself, I've heard from so many people from across the country who have suffered from this job, from tiny little newsrooms to big, national newsrooms, and everything in between. So that is frustrating for me.
I hear you, and I'm sorry to share that bad news about a former employer, but I wouldn't worry about blame. I'm with you. I don't think blame is going to get us anywhere. I actually believe that it is through positive engagement and enforcing positive behaviors and best practices. So look, Bell and some of Bell's unions, they're paying attention to the Taking Care survey. I've
Mm.
given talks at other news organizations and done work recently with some some closed captioning folks who work for CP24, which I think is Bell Media.
It is. Yep. There's our sister
So
station. Yeah.
slowly, things are progressing, I think.
Mm.
And the truth of the matter, like I said, it's culture change. And so it's not individuals that wake up in the morning and go into work and say, I want to be miserable to my employees. I just think that we have grown up in a culture in the newsrooms that they've behaved a certain way, tough exterior, suck it up. We don't talk about this sort of stuff, to slowly, and this is actually something that comes out of the Taking Care report, we're seeing a generational shift.
Mm-hmm.
Younger, newer journalists have different expectations of their employers. They have a different level of literacy and self-awareness and comfort level talking about and demanding good, positive mental health support.
Mm-hmm.
So, call me a wishful thinker, but I do think it's with time and education and patience. And I actually have a fair bit of empathy for those news managers who are
Mm.
working in news environments. No one ever gave them the tools
Yeah.
or the training to be specialists, to know how to talk to people, to say, hey, how you doing? It sounds like a weird thing, but it's true. Like
Mm-hmm.
it was always about the story and meeting deadlines. And if you were good at that, then you excelled and you got promoted.
Mm.
Putting the human people management skills back into this
Mm-hmm.
is going to require a bit of a pendulum swing back the other way.
We'll be right back.
It's funny, you just saying the whole, hey, how you doing? It brings me right back to this moment. And maybe there were several moments like this in my newsroom at CTV News Toronto. And I think I described one of these moments in the book, where there was this manager who, as a person, I really liked them. They cared, they had a big heart. And I think every once in a while, but I remember this specific time where it was rare that I was in the newsroom. I was usually out in the field filing, but I remember this specific time. I don't even know what the story was. I think I have a good idea, but it was a particularly bad one. And I was rushing from one end of the newsroom to the other, probably just like running over to tell something to somebody before going to voice a story or something. And then stopping and just being like, how you doing? And me being like, good, and as I was writing my book, I was sort of reflecting on this, like, were they asking me like, how am I doing? Like as a mom with young kids juggling this job, how am I doing on this particularly awful story? I don't think that they knew how to ask the question. And I definitely didn't know how to answer, because how do you even unpack that in a newsroom? Like you talk, I imagine you talk to newsrooms a lot. I talk to newsrooms a lot too about trauma-informed journalism. And it is so hard to be able to find a time to get everybody's attention for even an hour. Like an hour is obviously not enough to do this stuff, but newsrooms are so busy. And just to say, how you doing? Like that is a skill in it of itself, just to do that in a meaningful way in such a chaotic environment. And it's interesting too, because like you said, Bell Media wasn't on board with this survey, but I'm looking at my notes from the survey, and I had pulled a bunch of quotes from it. And one of them just happens to be from a reporter at CTV. So obviously the message got to the reporters, and maybe I'll read this quote. And there's so many like this in the report, but it says, I'm well wired for gross or graphic things, but hearing the pain of good people who are suffering is difficult. Put together with hostility in the general public, higher work demands, and some management that can be pretty unsympathetic or oblivious to our traumatic experiences. And I feel like it's getting harder to stay healthy and balanced with work, which is too bad. I mostly love what I do. Oh, that which is too bad, like really tugs at my heart, because I mostly love what I do. I'm like getting teary-eyed just reading that, Dave, because it's like, we love our jobs. I don't know if I would love it if I was doing it. I don't know. I do radio hosting and I do love that, but it's just, we love it. But like, why can't we just be healthy and do it? Why does it need to be such a sacrifice, such a personal sacrifice to tell these stories that we really feel are important and we want to share them with the world? But why do I have to sacrifice my brain for it? Why do I have to subject myself to this injury?
I do this exercise when I have the privilege of the time to teach a course or hold a session, where I ask people in journalism, what are the stressors of our jobs? And like that comment from that former colleague at CTV, like, yeah, it's deadlines, it's bosses that don't understand, it's the content of things we cover, it's the pace of work, it's the lack of resources, it's the public hating us. So okay, so we name all that, and then you ask them who loves their job, and people put up their hand and they love the job. And so you know what, we have to harness the good, because we do a really important job. And we are privileged to tell people's stories, even people who've gone through trauma. Those stories actually have a greater meaning. We're helping interpret and make sense of horrible things, and learning lessons from the criminal justice system, and helping our society make peace with horrible crimes that offend not just the individual families, but society as a whole. It's a privilege to do that work. So yeah, it's a funny contradiction between feeling like the work can be really painful and onerous, but being so passionate about it and driven to do it. And so I guess my whole gig is about trying to find a middle ground where we don't have to be burning ourselves out and getting injured in order to do the thing that we love. And I think there are ways to do that. And I mean, I'm in a really privileged spot to be saying that. I know in my own newsroom, we still got people being worked like at ridiculous rates. And part of it is because they're so passionate and willing to do it. And so sometimes we're fighting ourselves to say, hey, slow down. Let's do this in a better way.
So, I talk about this stuff a lot too, but through a slightly different lens. I'm all about journalism, well-being and self-care and all that stuff. But my lens has always been more through like a trauma-informed journalism approach. Anybody that listened to the first season of this podcast would know that most of the people that I talk to are trauma survivors talking about how they had been negatively impacted by the media. And I often say to people like journalists, you cannot adequately take care of yourself unless you're taking care of the people you're reporting on. Now, this whole mountain that you're climbing of journalism well-being is so huge, and there's still so much work to be done, but there's such important work being done as well. Do newsrooms who are increasingly talking about journalism well-being, do they have the capacity to also bring into that the conversation of how we interact with trauma survivors and whether we need to be doing that in a different way? I'll refer to a conversation that I had with a newsroom manager who was a good friend of mine a handful of years ago after I had launched my company and started talking about trauma and journalism and all this stuff. And she was a newsroom manager at a very large newsroom. And when I started talking to her about the impacts that, journalists have on trauma survivors, she's like, whoa, like we're just starting to talk about, is it okay for Black reporters to report on Black Lives Matter, diversity, representation, all these things. And now you're telling me there's this other huge thing that we need to fix. And it just seemed overwhelming for them. And so this well-being stuff is so huge. Can we take on another task as well? Or can we acknowledge that they're inextricably linked? Or would you even agree with that?
Oh, I think they're linked, but I think they're linked in a very simple, singular way. Understanding, right? If we understand what trauma is, I think necessarily we are going to treat our subjects better, the people we interview, because we're going to have an appreciation for, oh, this is what they've been through. This is why they feel a loss of control. This is why they feel harmed by journalists and journalism. So maybe I won't stick the microphone right in their face, and maybe I'll take a different approach. And I think journalists are doing that. There has been an evolution in my career. I'm sure you've seen it too, that there have been shifts in the way we, put people in front of huge scrums of microphones. And I think for the better, to some degree, to some degree. But that's because we're starting to understand even societally what trauma is. And then we reflect, on ourselves, on how we get affected by it, the more we can understand what trauma is. So I kind of feel like this literacy piece, the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, which is based at Columbia University, is they use the teaching of trauma-informed journalism as a bit of a gateway drug to get journalists to then also reflect on themselves. I just happen to be doing it the other way around right now. I'm starting with, let's talk about the impact on journalists within my own news organization, because that's where it was acutely affecting me. But it is inextricably linked to a better approach to our craft, the way we interview vulnerable people, the way we tell the stories, the way we make sure that people are taken care of after we've, making sure that, it's not our job to take care of them literally, but making sure that after an interview or checking in on people once the story's run, see how they're doing. I think those trauma-informed practices are for the better, slowly creeping into everything I see in journalism.
Like for me, that piece all comes back to moral injury. And I've said this so many times, and I think I said it to you in our previous conversation, that I've spent a lot of money dealing with the vicarious trauma part of journalism. I've spent went on therapy, but I've spent even more when it comes to moral injury. And you shared a story with me off air, and if you're comfortable doing so, I wonder if you'd share it now, talking about a time where you suffered some moral injury. And I don't know if you used that term, but you were doing a door knock, and basically you said to me that was the time that you got everything wrong. And do you know which one I'm referring to?
Oh yeah,
Are you
sure.
comfortable talking about that?
Oh, I am.
Perhaps in non-descriptive ways, so we don't identify the person you're talking about.
Sure. So it relates to the Russell Williams case. And I went and knocked on a door of somebody who I thought might know Russell Williams. And it turns out I was the first person that had knocked on this person's door, only to discover that this person had been a victim of Russell Williams, had been attacked and suffered violence at the hands of Russell Williams. I was a green reporter then. This is actually like a year or two before the guilty plea and the sentencing, before I got PTSD. So not entirely related, but at that time I did the reporterly thing. I was like, oh my God, this is a really great get. And I stuck my microphone in the doorway and I said, can I just ask you about that? And they kind of mumbled a few things. And I said, thank you very much. And I ran back to my van and I put them on the news 15 minutes later. And I regret that to this day. That is just the worst piece of the journalistic project. With a trauma-informed lens, I would have not pulled out the microphone. I would have quickly realized, oh, you were a victim. Are you okay with talking to me? Ultimately, I want to tell a story here, but I want to make sure you're okay with that first. I would make sure that they feel safe and have a little bit of control and that they would understand what they were doing. And if it appeared that they didn't, maybe I would choose not to put them on the news 15 minutes later. I tell this story to reflect on my own worst practices that I've learned from, to say that, yeah, journalists can learn, we can become better, and I made mistakes. But I also, that offended me. I did not sit well for some time afterwards. And I did, in the end, go back to this person and talk to them and realize that they didn't have much support. And I asked them if they had thought about support, and they asked, well, what are you talking about? I said, well, I know that there are some lawyers that are helping some other victims, and they would be able to probably get you to a doctor or a psychologist, that sort of thing. And so over time, I developed a different kind of source relationship, not just the door knock kind, where I tried to make right a little bit what I feel was really callous reporting and really insensitive reporting. And then when this person was prepared to give a more fulsome interview, they did, and they gave it to me. And I felt that there was some level of repair and respect that I'd regained for our relationship, but for myself, frankly, as a journalist, because I was not proud of that initial door knock.
Did you guys ever have a conversation about that in particular?
Yeah.
Like just the shittiness of being on air 15 minutes there?
Totally.
And what did they say about, if anything, about how it impacted them?
Yeah, it hurt them and left them. They were already traumatized, and we have to be careful with this word re-traumatizing. I didn't. People throw around this word re-traumatizing, and I'm not sure that that's what journalists do, but because I'm not committing the acts that Russell Williams did, though that's an initial trauma. But you can add and you can compound trauma by frustrating people's memories and their sense of control over what's happened to them. Now it's out on the radio, so you can cause injury to people who've gone through trauma if you're not careful. And so, they reflected to me that, that had been really hurtful and really painful, and they hadn't been ready to speak at that time. And come to think of it, I think I went back and asked for that tape to be removed from a later newscast. Now that I'm thinking it through, not that day. It didn't happen that day, but I know that because it was such a big story, a lot of the tape got reused over time, and the retelling whenever there was an advancement, right? And that's another thing, talk about losing control. A trauma victim tells their story once, and then suddenly it gets repeated, even when it seems like it's not relevant to their lives, but there's been an update in the court case, and suddenly we trot out all these old clips. So I think on their behalf, I said, we have to stop using that one. And that's something that we can do in the media. We can reflect very carefully that if we have a trauma victim who reaches out to our news organization and says, you got me at a really vulnerable time, and this is injurious to me, I'd like you to stop using that. I think that there's an ethical responsibility of news organizations to really consider that request, and probably, depending on how valuable it is and whether there's really any accountability built into what they told us, I think we should listen to the trauma survivors, and we should be scrapping those clips if there's no greater value other than just the tawdry retelling of the details of a crime or a horrible tragedy.
I completely agree. And thank you for sharing that story, Dave. I've shared many stories over the last few years of many, many ways that I got things really wrong when I thought that my good intentions were good enough. I wonder though, like you talked about, giving her a little bit of control. How much control should we be affording trauma survivors? Because obviously, like in my current role as doing a lot of advocacy for survivors, I advocate for, shifting that power back to the survivors and letting them do things that go against, many basic tenets of journalism, or the ways that we've been taught to do things like showing them a list of questions ahead of time, allowing them to veto that list, tell us, what they don't want to talk about, and then don't talk about those things, explaining the process, and then even showing your story to them when time permits before the rest of the public sees it, just to take away that element of surprise that can be so harmful to survivors. Do you think that there should be a line drawn, like when it comes to reporting on trauma and having our editorial independence? Should we be drawing that line somewhere, or should we be examining these on a case-by-case basis and reflecting on, well, why wouldn't I show them the story before it airs? Because that is the biggest thing that people push back on with me is, of course we can't show the story. Or I'll be working with a survivor and the journalist will say, don't tell anybody I'm sending you this, but here's the script so you can show the survivor, make sure it's okay, or just to take away that element of surprise. What do you think? Like, should there be a line to maintain our journalistic integrity?
I don't know that there's a line or a steadfast rule. I think it's case by case, but generally speaking, people who are victims of crimes, what are we asking of them? We want them to share the story. We want to hear their heartfelt explanations of what happened to them. If there's a public good, look, I don't want to hear people's stories of misery and victimization for their own sake. Generally, we tell these stories because there's something to learn from it, or there's something that a greater good from either awareness or seeking out the people responsible or what have you. But here's my line. A lot of the rules that we have are like, oh, if you said it, then we own it and we can do whatever we want with it. A lot of that comes from accountability journalism.
Exactly.
Right? So when we're going after politicians or corporate cheats or criminals, or if we got you, we got you kind of thing. It's like we're going after you to seek accountability. Trauma victims are different. We actually cede all sorts of control, and should, because what is our operating credo? It should be do no harm, or do as little harm as possible, right? And so if that's the case, if it's not an accountability interview where we think the person has to answer for something, then we're really just asking to have them share, something which we understand is, the painful worst day of their lives or whatever it is. Of course, there's all sorts of things that we can do. I mean, to the specifics of what you're suggesting, I have no problem. We do it all the time, sharing with people, maybe not the whole story, but here's what the headline's going to read, and here are the quotations we're going to use from you. We want to get this right. Is this right? Right? Are you comfortable with this? Oh, you don't want us to mention your daughter? Okay. How relevant is it to the story? Maybe we don't. Maybe we write that out because that person, like, I don't see any problems with that. We make those deals all the time. And I've had cases where victims of sexual violence in particular who have launched a lawsuit, or lawsuits are slightly different because they filed it in a public court, but people who want to come forward and they're seeking justice, and then they change their mind and they say, I'm just not ready. And as frustrating as that is for journalists and newsrooms that have spent the time I'm like, okay, because if we're really about ethical journalism and doing no harm, what is the value in putting this person's story out when they don't even want it out anymore?
Who are you serving?
Yeah, who are you serving? There's no public good in that.
I love that. And you make me feel so much better about the state of journalism. I know that for the most part, what you just described remains the expectation rather than the exception. But I love how just naturally you talk about that. Like, of course, like, yes, exactly. Okay, I want to shift the conversation back to the lessons that were learned from your Taking Care survey and how you've actually implemented that at CBC. Tell me, like, because you've learned what needs to be done. So can you give me an example of how you've actually put this in place to help take care of your colleagues, and what sort of lessons you've learned along the way?
So we hold training courses on well-being and trauma. I take part we do hostile environment training for people who go overseas, people who are currently, either covering Ukraine or the Middle East, or what have you. And we've built into that a whole section on mental health and awareness around vicarious trauma. So there's the education piece. The other piece that's harder is implementing newsroom protocols. And through 2.5, 3 years of delivering these courses and workshops, we do an exercise where we get people to plan out, if you had time to prepare better for a trauma story, what would we do before, during, and after, to make this a better experience? And over hundreds of people going through this course, we all come up with the same solutions. We got to talk to each other ahead of time. We got to check in with people. We got to ask people, are you up for this? This is going to be a difficult story. So talking about it, acknowledging, giving people an out if they're deeply affected or too close to the material, or something about it is not sitting right. And that's a real struggle for newsrooms and small newsrooms, as you pointed out. But we've brought in a protocol at CBC that we are now trying to scale out across our system, where the assignment process has to consider just like we would, do you need a flak jacket? Do you need extra warm boots because you're going into a freezing cold? Like, we think about physical safety all the time. What about psychological safety? So we're requiring that as a protocol within our newsrooms. We've also built a peer support network, which is a new level of support, colleagues helping colleagues, which, it's an extra thing. If people don't feel comfortable talking to their manager, they don't have time or resources to go to a clinician or a counselor. Maybe there's a wise colleague who has a little bit of training on how to listen and how to refer you to proper channels. We've got that up and running at CBC. And then what we're doing kind of in the industry, which is I'm out there trying to champion some of these causes, holding speaker series, holding the Taking Care round table, where we brought a whole bunch of people from around the country to begin talking about this, trying to figure out ways that we could get newsrooms having bigger discussions, in their own local newsrooms to embrace, talk about mental health, awareness around vicarious trauma. And look, I've got a whole bunch of projects I'm on the go. Training videos that will be produced by CBC in partnership with the Dart Center and the Canadian Journalism Forum on Violence and Trauma, that are going to be free for any newsroom, any journalism school. Some of it will be around trauma-informed journalism, the craft. Some of it will be around well-being, trying to build tools so that people can learn this stuff and people can share this stuff. Another project I have this desire in Canada for a proper list of clinicians who know how to help journalists.
Yeah.
Too many times in our EAPs or our support services, or, I hear from journalists, I went to a therapist and they told me to take a break from the news. Well, that's not terribly practical. They've actually figured this out. In the US, there's something called the Journalism Trauma Support Network, where they've done an intensive training. They've trained up more than 50 psychologists in different states on how to help journalists and understanding the journalists' workflow and experience, so that when they get clients coming to them saying, look, I need help with burnout or stress or trauma exposure, they're a little bit better equipped. I'm looking forward to seeing if we can do that here in Canada, because I think our people need it. We lack the resources, and we lack the specialized resources of what I call journalism-aware clinicians.
Yes. Yeah. It's funny because, so much of that too can just be solved by, like you said, when it comes to journalism and practicing trauma-informed journalism, like just understanding trauma and finding a therapist who just listens. Like the therapist who has really helped me over the last few years, I don't know that she's ever worked with a journalist before, but to have her say, like, in my first session, where I basically just sobbed the whole way through, this happened and this, to have her basically say, like, I'm so sorry that happened, and just to validate it right off the hop. And then she learned about my industry through me and just listening. But unfortunately, there are a lot of professionals out there, and I had one unfortunate instance with another therapist years earlier, where she was sort of like, oh, that's new. She'd never talked to a journalist, obviously, who had experienced vicarious trauma. Dave, what does the term trauma-informed journalism mean to you? Have you ever tried to sum it up? Oops.
I think it's understanding how trauma works, how it affects an individual, like biologically, psychologically, socially, and then applying it to our craft. And I use the term I use the term trauma aware more than trauma informed, although they're kind of interchangeable. But I don't know that you can be fully informed about somebody else's trauma, right? I think the best we can do is be aware and mindful and considerate, and bringing that consideration of the other person's humanity and how they've been deeply affected by life events to the work. That's how I'd put it.
When you think about that moment that you went to your whatever supervisor, the assignment desk, whatever, and said on that story, I can't do it, and the reaction that you got, compare that to where you are now. And I think it's fair to say that you set the bar very high and you've achieved many of those goals. And I just love to see the progress that you're making, and we'll all benefit from it. So I thank you for that. Is there
Well, that's
anything
kind of you.
Is there anything we haven't talked about, Dave, that you any other messages you want to get out there?
No, we've talked a lot. I hope you're going to edit this. Boy, you let me go on and on. And
No,
on.
I'm not. You are absolutely excellent. So thank you so much, Dave. There's many people that will benefit from this conversation.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course.